Tonight on Greater Boston, national security expert Juliette Kayyem joins me on the brutal assault on Nancy Pelosi's husband, just the latest case of violent extremism in the U.S. that has experts, law enforcement, and poll workers increasingly on edge as we near Election Day. Plus, the Supreme Court takes up a pair of cases that could reverse decades of affirmative action policies at colleges and universities. Joined by two experts with different takes on factoring race into the admissions process. While Friday's attack on House Speaker Nancy Pelosi's husband was certainly disturbing, it's hard to say it was shocking after the political animus and violent rhetoric we've seen in recent years. Prosecutors say the QAnon-supporting suspect, David DePape, went after Paul Pelosi with a hammer after he broke into the home and couldn't find the speaker. Federal prosecutors charged DePape today with attempted kidnapping and with retaliating against the federal official by threatening or injuring a family member, and police say he had a list of other people he may have planned to target. Paul Pelosi is still in the hospital, recovering from surgery to repair a fractured skull. While many prominent Republicans have spoken out against the attack, one in particular has not. His successor did, though.
We can't just say, I feel badly about the violence. We condemn it. Condemn what produces the violence. And this talk produces the violence.
I'm joined by former Homeland Security official Juliette Kayyem. Juliette's also a senior lecturer at Harvard's Kennedy School of Government, CNN commentator, and of course, a longtime Boston Public Radio regular. Juliette, it's good to see you.
Good to see you.
So if reports are to be believed, if Nancy Pelosi was home, it's fairly likely she would have been murdered. So does the attack on her husband, the brutal attack on her husband, and the near miss with her change anything, or is it just business as usual?
Well, I hope it's not business as usual. We certainly know from the suspect that the intended victim was Nancy Pelosi. He said, "Where's Nancy?" And he has now confessed after Miranda warnings to wanting to tie her up. Let's just make this clear. Tie her up. Get her to tell the truth. If she didn't tell the truth, presumably about the election, he would break her kneecaps so that she would have to wheel herself into the House chambers, and other Democrats would see what happens to them. So the idea that this is just like San Francisco crime is ridiculous, or the idea that Paul Pelosi is anything but a stand-in for her. And that's essentially what the federal charges are. They are, if you go after a family member with the intention of terrorizing or intimidating a public figure, it's the same. So this is political violence. There's no point in pretending otherwise at this stage.
You know, I mentioned at the top that a couple of prominent Republicans did do the right thing. Yeah. I want to talk for a second about a few who did not. Here is the darling of many of the moderates in the Republican Party, the newly elected governor of Virginia, Glenn Youngkin. Here he is.
There's no room for violence anywhere, but we're going to send her back to be with him in California. That's what we're going to go do. That's what we're going to go do.
And on the same day, Donald Trump thought it was important enough to mention the death of Jerry Lee Lewis, but the bludgeoning of the husband of the speaker merited nothing from the former president, who could have had an impact. And finally, the new owner of Twitter tweeted, as you see here, there's a tiny possibility there might be more to the story than meets the eye. We don't have to go into what it was, Santa Monica Observer, a sort of scandalous kind of thing. It was so empty that Musk himself deleted it 3 hours later. It seems to me that things like that from people in high places do nothing but encourage other people to do what this guy did, no?
That's exactly right. There's two reasons that they're doing it. So the first is, of course, they need a counter narrative to wipe their hands of a violent movement that they've certainly nurtured or embraced for the last couple of years. So even someone like Youngkin, who is apparently a moderate, he goes out to support the Arizona Republican, Carrie Lake, the Republican candidate, who is a absolute, stop the steal, January 6th truther type person. So there's no point in calling him a moderate anymore. So why is this happening? They need a counter narrative to focus away from them. And so that's essentially what's happening. We have no responsibility for this. And by the way, there's some other narrative. It's either crime or some scandalous, disgusting theory. And so then people start talking about that. The other reason why this is dangerous or why they do it is because obviously in the silence, even in the silence, let alone the jokes or the nurturing, this is where all of this violence festers because it is not shut down by the leadership of the Republican Party. And I have to say, look, I'll concede that there's violence on the left. We've certainly seen that on the left. You cannot say with a straight face that any person in leadership of the Democratic Party would support, let alone basically nurture and complement violence in the way that an apparatus led by their likely nominee in 2024 has done so. So that is what's happening at this stage. And the pathetic thing about it for the Republicans is they could really, Trump is weaker than they think, and they constantly treat him like Voldemort on Halloween. I'll mention that reference. And look, if they start to isolate him over this and other things, they can rid him of what he's doing.
Staying with the theme, I'd vote for Voldemort before I'd vote for the other one. Juliette, we all know that because the election was stolen from Donald Trump, according to Donald Trump, we got January 6th. Is there any reason to think that if any of the election deniers running for Senate or governor, like you just mentioned, Kari Lake, for example, if they lose, is there any reason to think that they're not going to say their election was stolen and thus, maybe only locally, who knows, more of the January 6th same is a week or so away from us?
That's exactly the fear, and I wouldn't anticipate Kari Lake would concede anymore. We're seeing this in Brazil. He has not conceded yet. Yeah. These are people who do not believe in democracy in any fundamental way or the peaceful transfer of power. They are essentially just babies and sore losers. The other thing that makes me a little bit nervous, as one should be going into next week, is certainly this narrative that is not proven in the polls, that things are awfully close in places where they really don't appear to be awfully close. Because what that's going to do, I understand media likes a dog, fight and whatever, but what that's going to do is every loser who would have who intended to lose will then claim that the vote wasn't fair. Look, Trump broke. He broke his oath in many ways, but the peaceful transfer of power will ultimately, I think, be his most successful policy in terms of legacy, because putting the genie back in the bottle is going to take a long time. It's going to just take decisive crushing, in the election, voting-wise, of this part of the Republican Party.
Speaking of crushing, you convinced me, after saying it repeatedly on the radio with us, that the relentless prosecution of January 6th insurrectionists would likely quell similarly minded people in the future. I just looked up some FBI statistics comparing domestic terrorism. This is from the FBI in 2020 to 2021, and you can see the numbers. I'm sure you know them. The numbers essentially doubled approximately from 2020 to 2021. So were you wrong or something else at play here?
No, I think that there's I'm not wrong. Let me tell you what is happening is there's no reason to suspect that these numbers are growing in terms of support for violent extremism. What we are seeing is that the violent extremism is becoming more tolerated in the Republican Party. So your overall numbers, there's not been a lot of attacks. Nancy Pelosi is a change of it. So how do I know this? I look at the same things you do, which is the recruitment efforts of the major terror organizations, which are depleted. They can't raise money. They can't recruit. The numbers for Trump, who is likely, despite everything, bankrupt, and he cannot fill a room in any meaningful way anymore. And he does these rallies. And this is the irony of the Republican, or, if people who want to save the Republican Party, which I hope they figure it out, which is this is the moment to begin that sort of purging of that element of the GOP, and in particular after Friday's attack against the Pelosi family. And they just can't seem to get themselves to do it, which may suggest they either don't want to or they don't know how. But this is something that the Democrats can't save the Republican Party from. They've got to figure out how they isolate this element, or for those who don't want it, abandon the party. But right now, I can't separate the violent extremism from the party anymore.
And one of the ironies, and I think you've said this too, if had a few more Republican senators a couple of years ago had the courage of what they said immediately after January 6th and voted guilty in that impeachment trial, we might have a very different America.
Yeah, well, I often, if McConnell had stuck to his post-January 6th guns and not folded, think how different the world would be. I mean, he would be, he'd be in Florida on his True Social. So this is a significant problem, but the frustration is that this is also solvable, but it's going to take the Republican Party to figure it out.
Juliette Kayyem, good to see you. Thanks so much for your thoughts. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Next up, the Supreme Court heard arguments today in cases seeking to end the practice of considering race in college admissions. The cases center on the country's oldest public and private universities, the University of North Carolina and Harvard, and they claim that the schools violate equal protection principles and discriminate against Asian American applicants by considering race as a factor, or a so-called plus factor in the case of UNC. The group Students for Fair Admissions, led by conservative activist Edward Blum, is behind both challenges. And while lower courts have ruled in both universities' favor in the past, the conservative majority in the Supreme Court today appeared very interested in Blum's arguments.
I don't see how you can say that the program will ever end. Your position is that race matters because it's necessary for diversity, which is necessary for the sort of education you want. It's not going to stop mattering at some particular point. You're always going to have to look at race because you say race matters to give us the necessary diversity.
Chief Justice Roberts. I'm joined now by Natasha Warikoo, professor of sociology at Tufts, whose book Race at the Top, Asian Americans and Whites in Pursuit of the American Dream in Suburban Schools came out earlier this year. Richard Kahlenberg is the author of The Remedy, Class, Race, and Affirmative Action. Also recently wrote a piece on the topic for The Globe, testified as an expert witness for the plaintiffs when their case was heard in the Fourth Circuit, and just stepped out of the Supreme Court where he listened to all 5 hours of arguments. Richard, Natasha, thank you both for your time. I appreciate it.
Great to be here.
Good to be here.
Natasha, why should the Supreme Court allow race to be a factor in admissions?
Well, it seems pretty clear that, in the previous cases that came to the Supreme Court, the court has affirmed that diversity is a compelling state interest. In order to create diversity, we need to have attention to race. I didn't hear anything today that negates that consideration, that suggests that race no longer plays a role in American society. So, I think that it's pretty clear, and we have a lot of evidence that there are all of these benefits in terms of educational benefits to a diverse learning environment.
So, Richard, again, I mentioned you're an expert witness for the plaintiffs. What do you think this court should be doing?
Well, first of all, I agree with Natasha that there are tremendous benefits to racial diversity on campus, and I want to make sure that we have paths to get there. But the research that I did for the case suggests that there are so-called race-neutral alternatives, that is, other means to getting racial diversity and the benefits that come from that. Harvard right now, for example, is majority minority, which is a beautiful thing, but it has 15 times as many rich kids as poor kids there. And if they were to give a break to economically disadvantaged students of all races, and to get rid of the terrible, preferences they give to rich kids through the legacy alumni preference, then you could get racial diversity without all the division that is associated with using race.
Before we hear what Natasha thinks about your proposal, you say in your piece in the Globe, again, you assert, as you do a second ago, that diversity is essential. The two of you agree on that. You say it's appropriate to use race as a last resort if other means could not achieve sufficient diversity. But the plaintiffs, on behalf of whom you were testifying don't agree with that at all, correct?
That's right. I have a different position from Students for Fair Admissions. I think that race-neutral alternatives in the vast majority of cases will work, and so you don't have to use race. But if there were an unusual circumstance where, let's say, an institution was located in an all-white state where it was hard to get Black applicants to apply, and they did everything they could through race-neutral alternatives, then I'd leave the door open a crack for race in those circumstances.
Natasha, what do you think about Richard's alternative to, according to him, achieve the same end?
Yeah, well, let me first say that I agree with Richard that absolutely these colleges need to be paying a lot more attention to class and that they need a lot more class diversity. You know, there's a dearth of students who are working class, poor, and even middle class and lower middle class. And so absolutely there should be a lot more attention to social class. But the evidence suggests that, you know, even if we look at class, there are more young people who are poor, more of our poor are white than are Black or Latinx, because that's the population of the United States. That attention to class is not enough to achieve racial diversity. Ending legacy admissions, reducing or ending athletic recruiting, all of these other kind of factors that were mentioned in court today. The data suggests, you know, that came from the case that these are, you know, that these will not be sufficient to achieve the racial diversity that affirmative action does. And that's pretty clear. So absolutely, you know, I think we should be paying a lot more attention to class, but that's not a stand-in for race. And I think we need to look at both of these things. It's not either or, you know, to me, it's both and.
How about it, Richard?
So in theory, I agree that I could see a world in which universities considered socioeconomic status alongside of race. I've been at this 30 years though, and the one time that universities start paying attention to class diversity is when they tool to use race to recruit upper middle class students of color is taken away. So in California, in Michigan, in Washington State, in Texas, Florida, that's when they really started paying attention to class, when they could no longer use race. And it was only then. So in theory, universities could do race alongside class. They never do though, in fact, because it's much cheaper for a university to give preferences to upper middle class students of color. That's what Harvard does. 71% of the underrepresented students are advantaged, socioeconomically advantaged. And so the way to get to the path of class and racial diversity is to use socioeconomic status as a way of moving forward.
You know, the one thing you both don't seem to agree on, do agree upon, that racial diversity matters. When I hear comments like at today's hearing from Clarence Justice Thomas, one of my least favorite things is when smart people play clueless, and he did that today. I've heard the word diversity quite a few times. I don't have a clue what it means, he said. Starting with you, Natasha, maybe it's necessary to do this. You touched on it at the top. Why does diversity matter other than to the individual involved? Why in the big picture does it matter?
Well, you know, after the Bakke decision in the late 1970s, a lot of social scientists went to task and said, like, well, what are the benefits of a diverse learning environment? And we see that there are, you know, students who are on more racially diverse campuses feel a greater sense of self-efficacy. We know that diverse groups make better decisions, are better at solving problems. They find down the line that there is greater civic participation, greater sense of efficacy in terms of leadership. So there strong, better racial attitudes. So we know that there are all of these benefits. And I'll just point out also that, you know, we can look at what happens when we end affirmative action by looking at states, as you mentioned, Richard, like California, Michigan, Texas, and it's not good. We see year-on-year declines in the percentage of underrepresented minorities on these campuses. There are knock-on effects on graduate schools. Those students are then less likely to graduate college and go on to graduate school. There are fewer doctors of color who are Black, Hispanic, or Native American because of this. And you know, we know that having a same-race doctor has an impact on Black patients' care. So there are all of these reasons why, you know, we already know what will happen, and it doesn't look good. So I think, you know, suggesting that they'll find class-based alternatives is, hasn't been the case so far.
Richard, you have the benefit that neither of us do. We both read about it. Neither of us were in the courtroom. You were. The media is suggesting, court observers suggest that affirmative action is gone as soon as the decision is written. Do you share that perspective based on the oral argument?
Well, going in, we knew that it was 6-3, a conservative, liberal divide. And there wasn't anything that I heard from any of the conservative justices that suggested that they really like the status quo and were ready to support Harvard and UNC. I think I see a much brighter future than Natasha does, though, on this. I mean, my reading of the evidence is in places like California. So that UCLA, to take one example, UCLA is 6% African American in a state that's 7% African American. UNC, which uses race, has an 8% Black population in a state that's 22% Black. So UCLA is doing pretty well in terms of finding race-neutral ways to get racial diversity. And on top of that, UCLA, UC Berkeley, these institutions are among the top 2 for socioeconomic diversity. So they are able to accomplish both goals. I mean, to their credit, higher education is dedicated to racial diversity. And when the tools are taken away, the kind of the bluntest tools, just preferring wealthy students of color, they find new ways to get racial diversity. And so I read those stories as much more successful than some have suggested.
If Natasha, if the result is a 6-3 or 5-4 decision, dumping affirmative action as a consideration or saying that it can't constitutionally be considered as a factor, what do you see in the future?
So, well, let me just say that, I think it's not a done deal. I think there were a lot of questions about this, like when does it end? And, I think Amy Coney Barrett in particular was, kept pressing this question. Okay, what about that 25 years that Justice O'Connor mentioned in 2003? Or if it's not 25, when is it? And so, I think that, I think there is an opening there. So I don't know that it's, I don't know that it's a done deal.
Well, let's assume it is, just for argument's sake.
So, if it is, I think it's not good. And again, I think we can look at states that have banned affirmative action to see what will happen. I think we will see a decline. We will definitely see a decline in Black, Latino, and Native American students on these campuses. I think the colleges will work hard, as Richard said, to try to increase the number of underrepresented minority students. I think it will be hard. Perhaps they will pivot to asking people to talk more about their biography because, it was interesting that the plaintiffs said that, you could consider race if a person talks about race-based discrimination or adversity or even just cultural identity.
And how it affected their lives.
Okay. So,
that was Chief Justice Roberts, right, today, I believe?
Chief Justice Roberts and the SFFA lawyer as well.
One last thing, if I may, maybe this is more appropriate for you, Richard, but if not, one of the things that I've never been able to quite figure out is how a man who admits that he benefited from affirmative action at Holy Cross and benefited from affirmative action at Yale Law School is probably the most powerful opponent of affirmative action as an older man. That, of course, would be Associate Justice Thomas. Do you have any insight into why it was good for him but not good for those after him?
Well, I think it's dangerous to speculate, but I would say that there are beneficiaries of race-based affirmative action who are resentful that their meaningful accomplishments are under a cloud. And so to the extent that this plays into Justice Thomas's views on affirmative action, I think it's perfectly logical and reasonable for someone whose accomplishments are doubted because of race-based preferences would say maybe there's a better way. And he is a very strong champion, by the way, of socioeconomic preferences. He says, the young Clarence Thomas did deserve a socioeconomic preference in admission. Now,
but he got a racial preference.
Right. But I'm saying that the next generation wouldn't necessarily. Obama has said that his kids don't deserve a leg up in admissions. But lots of the beneficiaries of socioeconomic preferences will be people like the young Clarence Thomas.
Natasha, you have any quick insight on that?
I mean, I can only speculate at what goes through Justice Thomas's mind. I think that he, I don't know what he would say. I think he's, pretty opposed to any kind of consideration of race. And, I think the question he kept asking, what is diversity? What is the benefits? Felt a bit disingenuous, because there is all of this research on the benefits of a diverse learning environment for students. So,
Natasha, I appreciate your time. Richard, thanks for coming in sort of from out of the rain. I appreciate you both. Thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.
That's all for tonight. We'll be back tomorrow. Thank you for watching. And please don't forget Ukraine.
In Newton, Massachusetts, there's a star market that overhangs the Mass Turnpike, and I was curious why that was.
I'm Edgar B. Herwick III, and this is the Curiosity Desk. Well, we start things off today in a place that I am confident is familiar to you all, a supermarket. This one is a lot like any other. The coffee's near the tea, the butter's near the milk, and the shelves are stocked with an abundance of options. Now, even if you've never been inside, you've likely driven under this guy. And while the building itself dates to the 1960s, its story begins almost half a century prior.
The Star Market began in Watertown. The first one opened in 1915.
That's Clara Silverstein with Historic Newton.
The owner was named Sarkis Mugar, and he was from Armenia.
Sarkis helmed the Watertown Star Market until 1922, when he died following an automobile accident. His son Stephen took over the store, and in 1930 opened a second Star Market right here in Newtonville. But the boldest leap came in 1948 with the Star Market's first supermarket. But Star Market was immediately on a collision course with the latest thing in roads, the modern highway.
More and more and more cars.
The Turnpike Authority wanted to go through Newtonville and take over the Star Market's parking lot.
The Turnpike Authority got its route, and the Mugars were granted the air rights to build a new store on top of the new Turnpike. The success of the Star Market project fueled the imaginations of developers and city leaders who saw a future with gleaming buildings over the pike. In reality, nothing has been built with air rights west of the city in almost 50 years, and so it stands over the pike today, a nod to Newton's past and to an imagined future that never came to pass. I'm Edgar B. Herwick III. Stay curious out there.
Next time on Anti